terms of materials, this is a super simple DIY project. The first thing that you're gonna wanna pick up is 2 furring strips. I've actually just taken one 8-foot strip and cut it into 2 pieces, but it definitely works better if you have at least a 6-foot stake, or even better, an 8-foot stake. I only had the one 8-foot, so I just cut it in 2. I've also taken each end and just sawed sort of a little makeshift point into it to make it a little bit easier to drive into the ground. We've got really tough soil here, and there's no way that I would be able to get it in there if it didn't have a little bit of a point on it. When you pick these up from the local big box store, just make sure that you check it over for any cracks or imperfections. This one looks pretty good, but I will say that it is pretty easy for them to buckle under the pressure, and they're a lot more likely to do so if there's already sort of a pre-existing breaking point. If you don't want to run the risk of cracking or breaking in the season, and these can crack or break during the season, go ahead and swap it out for an 8-foot T-post. They run for about 5 times as much money, but they are a lot more robust. Next, you're going to need at least 100 feet of string. This is just a nylon mason's twine. You can also try to use this natural fiber twine. I picked this stuff up from the dollar store. I will say this, I have tried to make this stuff work because it is a little bit cheaper, but no matter how I implemented it, no matter how much I used, it never worked that well. And I finally realized it's actually more expensive because you have to use so much of it. So definitely, unless you already have a ton of natural fiber twine, I would recommend just grabbing something synthetic like this nylon stuff here. It's so much easier to implement, so much faster, and it ends up actually being a little bit cheaper because you don't have to use nearly so much of it. Also need scissors to cut the twine as we go. Finally, optional depending on how compacted your soil is, I like to use a little rubber mallet to actually drive the stakes into the ground. All right, the first thing I'm gonna do is just get all the containers exactly where I want them. It's really tough to move the system once you've begun, so just make sure they're exactly right and they're nice and evenly spaced out. It's a little bit easier if they're not too wonky. Okay, I think that's good enough. The next thing that I'm gonna do is just make sure that the plants themselves are evenly aligned, as close as I can get them anyways. So not the containers, mind you, but the plants themselves. I know for me, very few of my plants are actually centered directly into the container because I normally companion plant them. And I wanna make sure they're as lined up as possible because that's gonna make the actual weave a lot tighter and a lot more effective. Okay, final bit of prep work here is I'm gonna try and rotate the plants so that the primary leaders are all running parallel to each other and parallel to how I'm gonna have the actual weave system going. You can imagine if you had, for instance, this plant going this direction, right? It's going like this, where the branches are coming out like this, and then we have this plant where the branches are primarily coming out like this. The weave system's gonna have a lot of a harder time pushing those together and keeping it all kind of nice and evenly contained. Whereas if they're all running parallel like this, it can kind of just smush them all in, a lot more effective. I lied, there's one more quick thing I'm gonna do to prepare the plants. All of these are obviously pretty large. They've been putting on tomatoes for a long while. Ideally, you'd be doing this when your plants are still quite small, a foot or so, up to 18 inches. Because mine are so huge and sort of overgrown at this point, I'm gonna give them a really aggressive prune job here. So I'm actually not gonna prune this last one here. We're letting it grow sort of wild as an experiment to see how a tomato does when basically you do everything wrong. I'll let you know how it goes. Okay, before I actually drive the stake in, take note that I have it positioned so that the pressure from the string is going to be against the short side of the stake. If I were to rotate this so that the pressure from the string is against the longer side of the stake, this thing is going to break and bend and crack over the season. I have found through experimentation and through learning the hard way that this is a much more robust, strong positioning than this. Otherwise, I just like to get it nice and tight up against the container. That way some of the pressure is actually dispersed into the container itself, rather than all of the pressure being at the point where the stake meets the ground. In terms of depth, I pretty much just try and get it as deep in there and as stable as I can get it. A lot of folks talk about getting those stakes at least a foot deep. I think that would be absolutely impossible in our clay soil, but just try to make sure that it is nice and stable and in there really snug. Okay, same deal on the other side. Okay, most important thing about the whole build is that there's tension on the string at all times. And so the way that you're going to want to do that is go ahead and tie the string to the stake, but then rather than running it right away, wrap the string around the stake multiple times, keeping it as tight as you can so that the friction between the stake and the string keeps the whole thing nice and tight. This may seem unnecessary, but I promise it is the easiest way to ensure that your Florida weave is successful. There are different methodologies for implementing the Florida weave. Some folks like to take the string and basically go behind all of the plants and then do a little figure 8 around the stake on the other side and then come in front of the plants and then pull it all nice and tight and kind of just create a little sandwich there. After quite a bit of experimentation, I will say I am not particularly fond of that method. I like to actually weave between the leaders or between the individual plants to create a true weave that really tightly grips each individual plant. So let me show you how to do that. I'm coming around to the back of the stake and then the back of this plant. And then this next one here, I'm going to go around the front. Obviously the stake is no longer doing anything. Keep in mind that when I talk about a weave, I'm considering each of these major leaders here as their own individual plants. So I'm not weaving in between each actual tomato plant. I'm weaving in between every main vine or every main leader. Each of these needs its own support. We went behind the last one, so I'm gonna go in front of this leader and then behind this next one. And then I'm gonna go in front of the stake. Let me just remove this temporary stake here. So as I mentioned, we went behind this final leader on this final plant. So that means that I'm gonna go in front of the stake. And then same deal as with that first stake. I'm not gonna tie it around just once. I'm actually going to loop the string, keeping as much tension on the string as possible. You should be able to see it kind of pulling on those plants. And then I'm going to loop it around multiple times, at least 3 or 4 times. If you don't do this, tension will not remain on that string and the system will not work. Okay. Got a good number of loops here. And now, as I mentioned, I came around the front side of the stake. So I'm gonna come around the back side of this time. And last time I went around the back side of this last leader. So this time I'm gonna go around the front side. And then we had gone around the front side of this next one. Sorry, I'm just caught on a tomato here. So I'm gonna make sure we're going on the back side of this next one this time. Same deal here. You can see that the string is on the back side of this one. So we're gonna go on the front side and just alternating on every plant or every leader, depending on how you have your tomatoes pruned, as we go through here. Then I'm just gonna bring the string all the way back to where we started. I went on the front of the plant, so I'm just going behind the stake. And then I'm gonna try and pull it as tight as I can. And then again, we're just gonna loop that string around the stake multiple times so that friction does the job for us. We don't have to worry about getting a really tight knot. That tight knot is not gonna do the trick. All of these tips that I'm mentioning are definitely things I learned the hard way, for what it's worth. I've tried so many different implementations with different materials, and all of this is just what I've found to work the best. Okay, so I'm gonna cut the string here, just leaving myself enough slack to use it to tie off. Again, I'm just tying it off to itself here where it came back on to loop onto the stake. As I mentioned, I'm not using this knot. I'm not relying on this knot to maintain tension. Tension was created by all of the times that we looped around this stake really tightly. Okay, so we did this one, I don't know, 6 to 8 inches up. Generally from here, I'm gonna just repeat the process every 8 to 12 inches. The stakes we have here are not tall enough to really support these plants at their full height, not even close. So I'm gonna go ahead and use slightly more rows of the string just to help give it as much tension as I can. Now that we've got everything strung up, go ahead and check that all of your lines are nice and tight. And if you do find that a couple of them are a little bit looser than you were hoping for, don't panic. I've got a really easy trick to fix that right away. All you need to do is grab a small, smooth stick, insert it between the line that's a little too loose and the stake, twist until taut, and leave it be. Voila. And that's really all there is to it. We've got 3 cherry tomatoes nicely trellised up, well supported. You know, it's probably not the absolute simplest system out there. It's probably not the absolute strongest trellis that you could build, but at about $5 in materials for 3 big indeterminate cherry tomatoes, I do think it is one of the most affordable systems you can put together for container tomatoes. So until next time, happy gardening, y'all.